Rules Committee will be in order. Today we are meeting on H.R. 807, Full Faith and Credit Act. And I want to welcome our witnesses and other members who are here today to discuss not only H.R. 807, but the important legislation that is contained within that. This legislation, I think, takes meaningful steps to ensure that the United States government does not default on its debt obligations in the event that the statutory debt limit is reached. I would like to thank both Congressman Tom McClintock and the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Dave Camp, for their outstanding work on this essential legislation. Additionally, I also would like to acknowledge the hard work of our colleague, the gentleman from Orlando, Florida, Congressman Dan Webster, who has added keen ideas to this issue that he has talked about for a long, long time, and also in his life of service. I want to thank Congressman Webster for his help on this issue. Defaulting on our debt would have disastrous consequences across every single sector of the American economy, and the United States cannot afford to continue in its economic demise or another recession. We simply must find a way to work together and to avoid a more detrimental struggle. The bill before us today guarantees that the United States government will not default on its obligations, and it is a responsible measure to avoid further economic damage. So I look forward to the testimony and thank not only Chairman Dave Camp, but also Ranking Member Sandy Levin of the Ways and Means Committee for taking their time to come and educate the Rules Committee on this important issue. I have talked this afternoon to our ranking member, our brand new ranking member, Mr. Polis, who is here representing Mrs. Slaughter, and he did not have an opening statement, but he's assured me that he's prepared and ready to go today. And so on behalf of the committee, we welcome both of you. Without objection, any written testimony that you have will be entered into the record, and without objection, we'll now allow the gentleman, chairman of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and ranking member. Appreciate it. The legislation before the committee today will achieve something that's vital to the U.S. and world economies, and it credibly and permanently removes any threat of default on the United States debt obligations. And if signed into law, never again will be in a situation where the full faith and credit of our country is questioned. H.R. 807 as amended would not increase the debt limit, but instead require the Department of Treasury to roll over existing debt by issuing debt outside the limit solely for the purpose of paying principal and interest on our current debt. Importantly, this legislation defines interest in a way that requires Treasury to make the interest payments necessary to ensure that Social Security benefits can be paid in full and on time. And in short, this bill protects both our nation's credit and our seniors. Now, this legislation also includes a provision to hold the administration accountable when using the authority provided in the bill. The amendment requires the Secretary of the Treasury to provide a weekly accounting to the Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees of the amount of principal and interest due and the amount of debt issued under this authority. If they try to game the system, Congress and the American people will know. Currently, the statutory debt limit is suspended until May 19th of this year. After that time, Treasury will once again have to begin using extraordinary measures until we raise the debt limit once again. This should give the President and Congress ample time to propose and agree to measures to get Washington spending under control. However, if Washington Democrats remain obstinate in their demand for higher taxes on American families and businesses, this bill will ensure that we don't default on our debt once those extraordinary measures are exhausted. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will argue that failure to pay an obligation other than interest or principal on our debt is simply another form of default. Yet two major credit rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, have indicated that they distinguish between failure to make a debt payment and payment on another obligation of the United States. According to those agencies, it is unlikely that a failure to pay an obligation other than debt would prompt a review of the United States credit rating. The consequences of a U.S. default on a debt payment could be very serious. A default would at the very least hinder an already stagnant economic recovery and in a worst case scenario lead the country back into a recession. Failure to make a debt payment will increase our borrowing costs and threaten our ability to make any of the other payments we owe. The legislation before the committee today also removes the potential obstacle of Treasury's supposed inability to make debt payments before other obligations once the debt limit has been reached. Despite the fact that then Treasury Secretary Geithner was prepared to prioritize debt payments in the summer of 2011, there has been some confusion as to whether or not the Treasury Secretary had the authority or the ability to enact such a plan. By requiring Treasury to issue debt to make these payments, this legislation provides an ironclad plan to avoid the risk of default going forward. The President and Congress must work together to reduce the growing burden of our debt and deficits, but we must do so without imposing more tax increases on hardworking families and job creators. In the summer of 2011, the failure to come up with a credible solution to our long-term spending habit led to a ratings downgrade. This could happen again if we don't seize the opportunity to enact bipartisan policies to reduce wasteful Washington spending and preserve Social Security and Medicare for future generations. The Ways and Means Committee has already begun to examine those policies and will continue to do so over the coming months. In the meantime, we must act to make it clear to the American people and the world economy that the U.S. will not default on a debt payment. The legislation before the committee today accomplishes that important goal. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I appreciate you not only taking time to be here, but for offering the ideas that you have, and we'll look forward to talking about that. Ranking Member, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Camp, and colleagues. I don't have any written testimony. I'd like to comment at some length because, though I think it's most unlikely, I would like to try to persuade the Republican majority in the interest of the nation, and I think beyond, not to proceed. But I have just received the statement of administration policy from the President, so I'd like to begin to read it and I'll comment on it. And I'll give the court reporter the exact language because I'll be interpolating within the SAP statement. So I'll start quoting it. The administration strongly opposes H.R. 807, which would result in Congress refusing to pay obligations it has already agreed to. When it's said by anybody that this bill would avoid the U.S. paying its obligations, that's not correct. It waives the debt ceiling as to some but not others. Some bills would be paid, others would not.
Gentlemen, we'll spin for a moment, please. I'd like to ask that the SAP be provided to all members.
Yeah, I've just received it.
Yeah, yes, sir. And with great respect to you, I just wanted to make sure all these other members had.
Okay, shall I wait?
We'll hold just a moment, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levin.
Mr. Chair, I'd like us to unanimous consent to submit the statement of administrative policy to the record.
Without objection, we will obviously ask that our President's SAP be included. The gentleman may proceed.
Okay, I thought you wanted me to wait until everybody had
I did want you to wait, and you may now proceed, sir.
Okay. American families do not get to choose which bills I'm continuing to pay and which ones not to pay. The chairman doesn't have a copy. Sorry, I just received it 5 minutes ago.
Well, sir, absolutely, and we're not trying to suggest anything other than it was just made available, and at the same time you received it, we did too.
Thanks. And the U.S. Congress cannot either without putting the nation into default for the first time in history. So let me interpolate where it said, and I took down, I think, your language, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Sessions, we will not default on its obligations. Essentially, that's what is being provided here. The bill would threaten the full faith and credit of the U.S., cost American jobs, hurt businesses of all sizes, and do damage to the economy. So let me just say, to interpolate here, I think everybody should remember 2011 and what happened when we played with fire, when there was a danger that we would essentially default. And what this bill does is essentially prepare at least the majority in this Congress, in this House, for a repeat of 2011. And economists are so clear about what would be the impact potentially of this. And I just would like to quote two former Bush administration economists. Keith Hennessy wrote that it would be, in quotes, the first step to becoming a banana republic, end of quotes, and would turn the economy into, in quotes, a bloody mess. Another Bush administration official, Tony Fratto, said that, quotes, prioritization is impossible, end of quotes, and he asked, in quotes, is the government really going to be in the position of withholding benefits, salaries, rent, contract payments in order to pay off Treasury bondholders? So now let me continue with the SAP. It would cause the nation to default payments for Medicare, veterans, national security, and many other critical priorities. So essentially what this legislation says is that we will pay bondholders in China, we will pay bondholders in Japan, we'll pay bondholders in the Caribbean, even bondholders in Iran and Iraq, before we would be obligated, and I'll just read some of those who are not guaranteed payment under this plan: American troops in harm's way, retired and disabled veterans, physicians, American small businesses who provide goods and services under contract, school lunch programs, universities doing medical research, college students earning Pell Grants, taxpayers due refunds from the IRS, etc., etc. And now I continue again. This legislation is unwise, unworkable, and unacceptably risky. Earlier this year, the Congress took a sensible approach to paying its bills that it had already incurred. That's what we're talking about. Bills already incurred by raising the debt limit. By contrast, the proposal in H.R. 807, which chooses which bills to pay, is a deeply irresponsible approach that is simply default by another name. And so let me just, there's been reference here to some of the credit rating entities. So let me just quote a gentleman by the name of David Beers, who's with S&P. He's the managing director of Sovereign Ratings. It would mean a very sudden fiscal shock that the longer it lasted would filter powerfully through the system. Potentially, that would be deeply disruptive to the economy, end of quotes. And this is from Moody's senior economist, Mark Hopkins. That's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So I now return to the SAP, to the administration policy. I won't read parts of the next paragraph where the President says he's continuing to work to find areas of compromise and common ground. This is, if I might interpolate, the exact opposite. And then he concludes, or this SAP concludes, for this reason, if the President is presented with legislation that would result in the Congress choosing to default on the full faith and credit of the United States, he would veto it. So you can try to, I conclude, find some distinctions between types of debt and whether or not they would have a specific impact. And that's, I think, something some credit agencies have said one thing, others have said nothing. But what is, I think, unarguable is we would not pay our obligations. It would be a default on our obligations. It would essentially give foreign creditors priority over so many Americans in this country. And it would create economic havoc. So why do it? To create some leverage? I frankly don't understand its purpose. I think I close by saying it's playing with fire, and if there is a political purpose, I think it has to be secondary to this nation's economy. Thank you very much.
Mr. Levin, thank you very much. I appreciate you and Chairman Kemp being here today. Chairman Kemp, I've seen you a number of years come before the Rules Committee. I've watched your work for many years, and I must confess I like what I see. Your clear thinking, your engagement, and your forward approach about trying to make sure that we speak about what we're going to do before we do it. This is a tough issue. We're now managing our demise of the country, not the success of the country, as a result of the years of overspending and our president's desire to harm job creation and to not search for every avenue for jobs where they would be available across this country. The job which I expect you to do as a personal member of this Congress, as you represent us as Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, I think you're doing well. I also would like to express what I currently believe is the Secretary of the Treasury, our brand new Secretary. I believe he understands and sees this perhaps in a different light than the previous Secretary, not trying to pick on anybody, trying to pat our new Secretary on the back and say that I believe that he will have the benefit of the past, of the things that we have been through, and to understand that the President is less likely to engage the Congress of the United States or any of us elected officials here about what plans might be. We have well understood what happened with the debt limit increase and how we got sequestration. We went to the super committee, and not one idea came out from the Democrat or the President's side that would be voted on. It was only a Republican idea, which was soundly defeated 6-6. And then we saw the President, when he was a candidate, say we would not engage in sequestration, that it would never happen. And in fact, the President did nothing that I could tell to get in the way except to say it shouldn't happen. So I admire you for taking on this issue before it's a problem. I admire you for engaging the Secretary of the Treasury and the White House on this issue. I think if we simply wait and wander into territory which we really don't know a lot about, it's a mistake. And so I applaud you, as I previously applauded Mr. McClintock and Congressman Webster, on your ideas, your clear thinking, and things that we can grapple with from a public policy perspective, be better prepared. So I want to thank both of you for being here today, in particular Chairman Kemp. Thank you for your great service in the legislation that you bring today. Mrs. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to associate myself with your comments, particularly about Chairman Kemp, and thank him for his service and the work that he has done and is doing. And I have no questions. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Polis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Chair and the Ranking Member of the esteemed Ways and Means Committee. This bill deals with eventualities that all of us hope do not transpire. In many ways, it deals with a potential crisis of our own making. I guess I would ask Mr. Camp. In trying to understand this bill, we realize there's a possibility that the Republican majority in Congress might not lift the debt ceiling. Absent this bill, payments might be missed on the debt. It would effectively put our nation into default. When this sort of things happens in the private sector to companies, there is bankruptcy, and in those proceedings, debt holders come first. It seems to me the general concept here is replacing debt holders first. But the issue is when there is a corporate restructuring or bankruptcy, and usually there's something of value there, they're effectively allowed to operate for a time. So, in the interest of the bondholders. So even in this case, in the interest of the bondholders, if we are not able to secure our borders and members of the armed forces aren't paid and weren't able to fund our basic obligations, doesn't that jeopardize the future revenue stream of the government and therefore our ability to service these debts in the long term? Is this even what our creditors would want? It seems to me that this in many ways sends a worse message because we're effectively jeopardizing our ability to collect revenue over the medium long term, even if you're starting with the premise that it's the most important thing. Mr. Camp?
Well, I would just say the purpose of this bill is to make it clear to the world and to the country that the U.S. will not default on a debt payment. So that's the main purpose of this legislation.
The simplest way to do that would be simply to raise the debt ceiling and not default on it, though.
Well, we will reach the debt ceiling in May, mid-May. We then believe with extraordinary measures that we'll have maybe until September. Some are saying maybe as late as October. It's a little unclear the exact time. But in that time, we have to negotiate between the parties what the path forward is going to be. There's clearly a very big difference of opinion. And we think in our party that higher taxes are not the direction we should go, but we're going to need to resolve the long-term fiscal situation. Revenue to the U.S. government is going to double in the next decade. This year, revenue is going to be the highest ever in the history of the country. We don't believe there's a revenue problem. We believe there's a spending problem.
Well, again, taxes would require separate action. It's a different issue. I understand there's some that want different rates of taxes. Certainly, the jurisdiction of your committee. But Mike, this is the kind of spending side. Why isn't this a mechanism like what, let's say, the sequestration was, where the pain is across the board, rather than singling out Social Security? We all love Social Security. That's great. Singling out interest payments on the debt, maybe we like or we don't like that, and saying all these other things like paying the troops in the field and investments in education and veterans, that these things are below the two things you're singling out. Why not use some automatic mechanism like sequestration? We're just talking about the expenditures.
Well, as we move forward over these months, we want to take away the threat of default and the talking point of default, because we believe that is actually harmful to our economy as well. And as two credit rating agencies have said, if you don't pay principal and interest, that's the downgrade in credit. Any other obligations of the United States that aren't paid out of general funds, they say that it's very unlikely that would cause them to review our credit rating. So what happened before was our credit rating did go down, and so we need to get our fiscal house in order. And this takes away the threat of default and the concern, because principal and interest would be paid. And obviously interest is defined in such a way that it would allow Social Security payments to continue to be made as well.
And of course we need to get our fiscal house in order, and I think that what that means is the Speaker and yourself and our leaders and the President, Senate leaders need to get back to the table and figure out a comprehensive deficit reduction plan that restores fiscal integrity, as the super committee attempted to do. That is the main event.
Yes.
There's this stuff going on the side, and of course you cite the danger of missing payments in our national debt and a downgrade. What this creates, though, is a danger which I think the markets would perceive an as great or greater danger, which is the danger of the failure of our state, the failure of our nation state. What kind of state can operate without paying its troops in the field? What confidence would bondholders have that we would make bond payments in 5 years and 10 years if that happens?
Well, our debt is 100% of our economy, actually more than that. So there's a point where how long can an economy operate borrowing? And so we're at a very critical juncture here. I also know that not all of our debt's held by foreign countries. A lot of our debt's held by America.
I didn't bring up foreign countries.
No, but I just want to make that point that our debt is not foreign debt necessarily. Some of it is held by foreigners, but a lot of our debt is held by Americans.
Yeah, and I didn't bring up who owns it. Again, the issue is, if the issue is to enhance investor confidence, this entire route is not the route to go down. I mean, even talking about missing debt payments or our nation state failing entirely of our own doing is not a constructive step towards inspiring confidence in the global markets. So again, even if the goal is to restore confidence, why wouldn't this be some across-the-board mechanism analogous to sequester, rather than saying, unlike in a corporate restructuring, even though it destroys your very operation that the bondholders want to keep in the long run so that they can get their payments, just so they can make a few short-term payments?
Well, the administration will be able to determine what obligations other than principal and interest and Social Security will be paid. I mean, they will make that determination, as Secretary Geithner was prepared to do, as was reported widely in Bob Woodward's book. They were prepared to do that. This would require them to have that responsibility and make that determination.
Yes, Mr. Levin.
The assumption of the majority here is that the only thing that affects credit rating is paying bondholders. And we'll debate this on the floor. That isn't the position of all the credit rating agencies. That's number one. Number two, I mean, you put your finger on the heart of this. We're picking and choosing. And let me just read a statement relating to your question from the Chamber of Commerce. If you start to do that, this is reference to prioritization, think of what happens. I'm quoting, everybody wonders, well, who's the priority and who's not the priority? And then the bond buyers will probably begin to demand a premium to purchase the next 25 billion bond sale. It's tough after the fact to redescribe and redefine what you sold the day before. I mean, the consequences here for the majority here to focus only on the issue of what happens if we don't pay bondholders, and they add Social Security, which was something new because they're afraid of seniors. But what about everybody else? And the answer is that our economy is in jeopardy, not only the bondholders. Our economy is in jeopardy. And why place it in jeopardy? That question hasn't been answered except reference to the fact we have a large deficit. Well, let's address it. Or that we shouldn't have more revenues. We disagree vehemently on that. Let's debate that and not tie it the way they're trying. They're tying this to a kite that is in real danger of having major implications. And also, why do it when it can't become law? There's reference here to the Secretary of the Treasury. This is the statement of administration policy. This can't become law. There aren't two-thirds here. There isn't the majority in the Senate. Why do this when it can't become law? What signal is being sent except jeopardy? I don't get it.
You know, the deficit is bad. I've heard that from both of you. We need to do something about our fiscal integrity. I, as a member, try to contribute to that solution. I've been supportive of the Bowles-Simpson package. I'm supportive of all efforts to remedy that. But what we're seeing before us here is a quote-unquote solution that's worse than the problem. This eventuality that we're talking about, I firmly believe, and I'm confident that most economists and, yes, bondholders would agree as well, this whole eventuality and endgame is worse than our current deficit levels. I guess I would, just a final question to Mr. Camp, I mean, do you feel that this eventuality and this endgame that we're contemplating here, where this actually occurs, is that somehow less harmful to our country than even continuing to kick down the road on the deficit and not doing anything?
Well, there was $600 billion in additional revenue at the beginning of this year. Estimates are that revenue for this year will be the highest ever. We believe that revenue is not the problem, that we have a spending problem. So therefore...
Real quickly, you need to talk to your colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, because the spending comes from Congress. I mean, your committee is in charge of the revenue.
No.
If you don't like congressional spending, just stop spending it.
Well, 2/3 of it is not voted on in Congress of our spending. Only about 1/3 of it is. So a lot of it is on autopilot. So this is why there needs to be a broader solution to all of this that involves both the mandatory and non-mandatory sides of the ledger. But the important thing is both Moody's and Standard & Poor's. I'm willing to name the credit agencies that have said that they view other obligations other than debt and interest on debt differently. And so we want to make sure that as we move forward in this debate that the threat of default is taken away. This bill would do that. This would take away the threat of default because they would be required to at least pay debt and interest on the debt.
Default on some things and not on others.
Well, non-debt and interest payments are not default in the same sense in terms of credit rating.
Yeah, I would argue
and
that they constitute a failure of a nation state, which is hardly the way to inspire confidence in our debt holders. But I do agree that we need to address the deficit and the debt. We hope that your bipartisan efforts, both Mr. Chairman as well as the ranking member, reach success. I understand that they involve other committees of Congress, not just appropriations in your committee. You mentioned other programs. And we hope to involve leading leaders and members of those committees as well. There's not any single solution, but I do believe that on balance, this bill is a worse endgame than a outcome which I certainly think we should avoid, which is doing nothing. But we're creating an endgame that is worse than the default, and I don't see how that is in the interest of our country. And I hope that we can get back to discussing solutions rather than a downward spiral that could threaten the integrity of our nation state. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields his time. Mr. Bishop.
So when you have the difficulty of deciding whether to give your employees comp time or overtime, I'm sorry I was so excited about last night. I'm kind of on a high. I appreciate the opportunity of being here, and even though this bill, as I will be told quickly, will be vetoed and will never be considered by the Senate, it's still the right thing to do, and I appreciate you bringing it. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGovern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you both for being here. And because we know this is going to get vetoed by the President and going nowhere in the Senate, it makes it frustrating to yet have another Rules Committee meeting to consider another piece of legislation that is not doing anything to help anybody, but basically amounts to a press release. And before getting into kind of the merits of the arguments here, I mean, it is frustrating that we are dealing with, we still have sequestration going into effect that is wreaking havoc on our economy. People are being furloughed, people are losing their jobs, food banks are being closed. I mean, that ought to be a priority, that we ought to be able to fix that, but we're not. We're doing this, or we're doing the bill that the Rules Committee approved to consider yesterday. We heard a lot of talk about budgets. The Senate has to pass a budget. We need to go to conference and have a budget. House passed the budget, Senate passed the budget, no conference. We're sitting around. All of a sudden, that's no longer a priority. And then we're doing this. And as I understand this, is it require the Treasury Department to pay foreign bondholders, including foreign bondholders like China, before the men and women of our armed forces, before veterans, Medicare service providers, or small business owners. And, to be honest with you, I don't, at this particular point, I mean, if this were to become the way we're going to do things. It doesn't matter what Moody's or anybody else says. I mean, those soldiers, those veterans, those people who rely on Medicare, they're going to be out of luck. They may not get paid at all. This bill doesn't do anything to prevent default. It just merely ensures that we don't default on the part of our debt that we owe to bondholders such as China. So if we want to make China happy, this is a nice thing to do. But I don't think it does anything to provide any security in our economy, and it certainly doesn't do anything that is going to help anybody who is in need of help. I'm looking at the vote in committee. I assume this was a strictly partisan vote. I mean, I don't think any Democrats vote for this. I don't know if there are any Democrats that are on his co-sponsor.
It's not the first time.
Yeah, no, I know. But I'm just saying, look, I think we're beyond the point of, political posturing. I think some of the things that we have done, that we've allowed to happen, are hurting people. And I think people are expecting us to fix things. And look, we have a problem with our debt. We need to get things taken care of. Maybe one thing we might want to do is say that from this day forward, we're not going to go to war unless we pay for it. You either find an offset or you tax people. If people don't want to pay for war, we ought not to go to war. But trillions of dollars of our debt are a result of 2 unpaid for wars. That to me is a concrete, thing we can do that actually might make a difference and might be real. But this, we still kind of limp toward this vote on the debt ceiling with a whole bunch of uncertainty, and I just don't have any questions because we're coming to this committee considering bills that are going nowhere, and I think we're squandering an important opportunity here. And this really is a time, for Democrats and Republicans to figure out a way to deal with our greater budget crisis. And, this is a time where we actually should be huddled with the White House or with the Senate, a bipartisan way, trying to figure out some of the tough choices that we're going to have to make and that you're going to have to make. But that's not what we're doing here. And I don't think this contributes to getting us any closer. This is just more kind of polarization. And so, I wish we were doing something else other than this. And I thank the chairman for the time. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Woodall. I'm sorry, Chairman Cole.
I got here late. So.
No, it's my fault. I did not have you down early. That's my fault. Mr. Chairman, you're right.
You may not think so when I'm done, because I got to tell you, if I hear, we pay for every war, we've never paid for a war in our life that we fought, including the revolution. And the president.
That's not true.
That's actually true. And the president, by the way, tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan, expanded our presence, and didn't offer a pay for that I recall as he did. So that's just not the way you conduct foreign policy I'm sorry?
It ought to be the way we conduct foreign
policy. Well, no country in the world has ever done that. We wouldn't have fought. That's just not what you do.
Well, when George Bush the
first
went to war, he actually paid for it.
Actually, yeah, if you can negotiate that every time, good luck. We didn't pay for it. Other people paid for it. But that point aside, I want to congratulate you first for bringing the bill. And look, I understand it's controversial, and I would actually agree with my friends on the other side. If we get to the point that we have to use this kind of bill, that's a real disaster. I would agree with my friend on that. We should never arrive at that point. But I recall being here when we were told, don't worry about sequester. You don't need to prepare for that. That'll never take place. Well, it did. And, and by the way, I didn't notice that's a two-way street. The president didn't offer any real solution. He just miscalculated. I would say the Republicans probably miscalculated, and we had no fallback position for when miscalculation occurred. So I'm not telling you I hope this happens. I actually hope it doesn't happen. And I'm quite willing to work with my friends, and I think I've demonstrated that on Fiscal Cliff, VAWA, and Sandy on bipartisan solutions. But having a safety net when they don't work is probably a pretty prudent thing to do. Now, I would hope, again, this is a sign. This is the president says he's not going to negotiate over the debt ceiling. That is a very provocative statement, as if he gets to decide all by himself what we will or won't negotiate over. And I would say that's an irresponsible statement. This is probably a sign back, well, if you really want to go there, we're going to start preparing for that then, because there's not going to be the votes to deal with the debt ceiling absent some serious effort to deal with long-term spending problems and what have you. And I applaud, you've been a champion of that, Mr. Chairman, all the way through. I applaud you for doing that. I applaud you for trying to wake up everybody to how serious it is by saying we are going to prepare for the worst. We hope it doesn't happen. We would much prefer a larger negotiated settlement that puts us on a path that we can agree on. And again, I think we have plenty of people that demonstrated, you amongst them on many occasions, that you're willing to do that. But we're not just going to willy-nilly raise the debt ceiling. Just not going to happen. The votes are not here to do it. That was a tirade, not a question. But I will ask you this, and I mean this serious, and I mean this because I respect both of you, two of the really best members of the United States House of Representatives. If not this, what policy would you recommend if we actually did? To say that we can't mess up around here and hit a debt ceiling crisis, I think, is to ignore the most recent situation over sequester. So if we didn't do something like this, what would you envision that happened if a deal wasn't reached?
Well, this was what was done in '96 when we had the budget problem. So this is not the first time this approach has been attempted by the Congress, and it was done successfully. And ultimately, there was a negotiated budget solution then. And so I think part of this is important to demonstrate that we're serious about paying our debts, that we're not going to default, and then that sets the stage for how then do you discuss the solution. And, obviously it's going to take people getting together, because I would agree with you, there is not the consensus in the Congress to raise the debt limit just with no other changes. So whether it's some of the entitlement reforms that will help us make those programs solvent for the long-term future, the President put some of those ideas in his budget. That's another area. Obviously, comprehensive tax reform is an area where we could actually grow the economy and, again, increase revenue to the government, making a debt limit increase not as critical. There are a number of other things and obviously the committee's working on tax reform, but there are a number of other areas. But I think most people think any type of consensus solution between the administration and the Congress will include those things.
Answer briefly, respectfully.
Certainly.
Whatever the options are, paying some bills but not others isn't one of them. The impact on that, economically, we've been through it, and virtually every economist says don't do this. And it doesn't matter their backgrounds, whether they were in this administration or that administration. It's not an acceptable option. And it's irresponsible. It isn't workable. We haven't discussed that. There are 80 to 100 million bills a month paid. Treasury says they can't do this. But are we really going to essentially say pay some, but not all of those I've listed? So you can argue technically what is a default and what isn't. But when you don't pay the people listed, essentially we're defaulting on our obligations. And so the fact you pay bondholders and no one else except retirees, to say that isn't default, in my judgment, is tautology.
My friend and I don't disagree on that. We really don't.
And you can't vote for this.
But I would also say it's also irresponsible to continue spending without any corrective action whatsoever.
Okay, but
that to me is incredibly irresponsible. And
so let's discuss the corrective action. This isn't corrective. This isn't corrective. And that's one reason it won't happen. It's not corrective. Talking about kicking the can, you're kicking a lot of people, and the nation economically.
Again, I don't think we disagree fundamentally, although I would say preparing for the worst when we've seen it happen around here is not always a bad strategy. And I also want to ask my other friend from Michigan. You guys are kind of confusing. I'm sure both our friends from Michigan.
We like that confusion.
But no, you are. I mean, look, you guys are a really classy matchup, and I mean that in all sincerity on that committee. I think one of the common myths, and I want to ask, no, I haven't ever said that about you, but I will. I want to ask my friend the chairman, one of the points we hear quite often is that it's unusual to link anything to the debt ceiling, that, this should just unilaterally pass and should not. And I'd like you to quickly, just for the record, and you may have done this in your opening remarks, and I wasn't here, and I apologize, but I've heard you do this before. Talk about the deals that have come before that the debt ceiling has actually been a trigger to.
Yeah, actually, most of the time, the debt ceiling is not raised without other policy along with it, and I will submit to the committee in writing all of the occasions where that's been done, but more often than not, there are substantive issues that are connected to help raise the debt ceiling. And let me just say, this legislation is an attempt to fix all of our budget problems, but it is an attempt to take the idea that we'd risk the full faith and credit of the United States government off the table as we move forward on these very difficult issues. But it isn't an attempt to fix everything. But it is an attempt to, at least as we move ahead, and this was done in '96, so this is not the first time. But yes, often the debt limit has other policies and has often been raised for a very short period of time while these matters are negotiated. So this idea that we simply raise it for a long time with no conditions attached is not the way that's been done in the past.
Well, I appreciate that, and I just want to thank you for preparing, but more importantly, I want my friends to understand on the other side of the aisle, I agree with them. I think many people do. This is not where we want to end up, but if the President were to insist that the debt ceiling be raised without condition, without change, without reform, and I say this isn't a judgment or judgmentally, I just say it as a political analyst, there aren't the votes here to do that. That's not going to happen. So we'll either have a serious negotiation and we'll achieve some of the things I know both of you want to achieve in the area of tax reform, and hopefully I applaud the President for some of the things he put in his budget on entitlement reform. I think that took a considerable amount of courage on his part, and I know he's caught some flack from his side of the aisle from that, and I would argue has not been appreciated enough from our side of the aisle for that. I consider that a good faith effort by the President of the United States. I don't think it's enough, but I think it's a step. And we're going to have a lot of steps. I actually see this legislation as one of the steps that hopefully moves us toward the larger deal. So I appreciate my friend, the chairman, for arguing for it, my friend, Mr. McClintock, for bringing it, and I look forward to supporting it. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Cole. Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the great pleasures of being on the Rules Committee, other than the good hours the Chairman allows us to.
Well, it's the extra pay, too.
And the extra pay is a perk.
Wait, now, the gentleman, Mr. Burgess, got comp time. So you took the pay, he took the comp time. We're just glad it was an option.
I say sincerely, it is a great perk that some of the brightest minds in the Congress come and you invest in us while you're here. I want to take advantage of that, even though bringing this bill to the floor is not in dispute. Mr. Levin, you said compellingly, I don't even know why we're going down this road. The President said he's not going to sign it. The Senate said they're not going to take it up, and so this just is not a valuable use of our time. Am I paraphrasing correctly?
Yeah, I don't mean to speak for the Senate. I think it isn't likely to come up, but it's more than a waste of time. I think saying to this nation that we'll pay some bills but not others, even if there weren't action in the Senate, is beginning to play with fire. I think, and that's why I read the statement that was earlier from the chamber, and my guess is if you get on the phone with business people who are actively engaged in this, I think a lot of them will tell you this is not a good idea. It sends the signal to a lot of people that we won't pay billions and billions of our bills.
I happen to have the great pleasure of sitting beside Mr. Cole from Oklahoma, who I think is one of the finest analysts of voting and politics across the country. And I think he said quite accurately, when he looks out there, he doesn't see the votes to pass a clean debt ceiling. But I read the statement of administration policy that you brought and handed out, and the president says, "I'm unwilling to do anything. I'm unwilling to negotiate around the debt ceiling." I understand everyone's entitled to their opinion, but could you distinguish for me why our planning for a bad outcome is playing with fire as you see it, and his insistence that it can only happen his way and no other way is a less dangerous course of action?
Because as he says, and he's acted on it, he's willing to sit down and discuss the issues that you all have talked about. There's already been action taken on the deficit. He proposed a budget that proposes more. He's insistent on revenues. We need to discuss this, but to try to tie these issues to a debt ceiling issue, and in this case, to tie all of this to paying some bills but not another, is a bad idea. It continues to send to the world that we may not pay our bills, and we may not pay massive amounts of our bills, and we may not pay bills to people who are fighting for us, and we're going to pay bondholders because of the way credit agencies operate, but as they have made clear, they take into account something besides paying bondholders. They're not to put them on the pedestal and everybody well beneath is, I don't get it.
Well, it's part of planning for a really bad eventuality, right? I mean, an eventuality that absolutely no one that I've spoken with hopes arise. But I know you don't suggest that you speak for the president, but I'll use some of his words. Back in 2008, he said, "The problem is that the way Bush has done it over the last 8 years is take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt. That's irresponsible. That's unpatriotic." In fact, I believe he voted against every debt ceiling increase that was requested in the time he was a United States senator. He said in 2006, "The fact that we are here today debating the raising of America's debt limit is a sign of leadership failure. Raising the debt limit itself," he said, "is a sign that the U.S. government can't pay its own bills. And because raising the debt limit in and of itself was a sign that the government couldn't pay its own bills," he said, "I therefore intend to oppose the effort to increase America's debt limit." We're going to have that debate. That's not the debate we're having today. Seeing how polarizing this issue is. I mean, so polarizing that the president was each and every time on one side of the issue while he was a senator voting on it, and now each and every time on the other side of the issue as the president of the United States. Do you really believe that planning for this eventuality, perhaps this isn't the best way to do it. I believe that it is, but perhaps it isn't. Do you really believe that taking some steps to plan for the inability to agree on raising the debt ceiling is an irresponsible course?
No, I'm in favor of our having serious discussions about all the issues, including the sequester, which I think is hurting millions of Americans. I'm all in favor of doing that. But I think this sends very much the wrong signal. And I'll leave it at that. I think if you vote for it, you're essentially indeed expressing priorities. And I think they're the wrong priorities.
Chairman Camp,
Thank you.
I read with great interest a joint tax report that came out this week, talking about the opportunities for fundamental tax reform and how that conversation has been moving along. I know the two of you have been working very hard on that. I know the President's talked about it in 3 of his 4 last State of the Union speeches. Is that one of those opportunities for common ground?
Well, I think it is. I mean, it's an opportunity to obviously reform a badly broken tax code, which is frankly a nightmare, except it's real, so it's not a dream. And also to get some pro-growth policies that will actually help our economy, prosper and families get jobs and increase their wages. And as a result of all that, we could see more economic activity and more revenue to the government. So it is a possibility that tax reform, as in the past, tax reform has resulted in more revenue to the government. And so we're very hopeful. Obviously, there's a lot of work to still do. But the working groups, the report you referred to was a compilation of the results of the 11 working groups. And as a committee, we're going to start to review those this week.
Is there any fundamental reform proposal that's being seriously considered that takes current levels of revenue as a percent of GDP and lowers them?
No.
Not one?
No.
Mr. Chairman, it is one of my great frustrations here. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, said accurately that the President wanted revenues to be part of this discussion. I read this joint tax report. I come around with the same conclusion that the Chairman has just confirmed for me, and that is that every single proposal we're talking about takes current levels of revenue and raises them. And to be lectured in a statement of administrative policy by a president who said never, ever, ever, under any circumstances will I ever raise the debt ceiling because it's immoral, it's unpatriotic, and it's irresponsible and a failure of leadership, to be lectured by that president's statement of administration policy when I'm sitting here with a committee that is working in tandem in a bipartisan way, not just to come to a solution, but to come to the first solution since 1986 that we've had on something that will not only make our small businesses more competitive, our multinationals more competitive, our tax code simpler to comply with, but will also give the president the revenue that he continues to talk about. Far from being a sign of intransigence, this bill that we're talking today is not preparing for House intransigence, it's preparing for presidential intransigence. And I want to thank you both, again, for tax reform, near and dear to my heart, for working in the most serious and constructive way that I've seen in the 20 years that I have been watching this body. My optimism cannot be much higher than it is right now.
If I might just comment on something before, we'll get a written copy, but to Mr. Cole's comment, in 1987, the debt limit increase included the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control and Reaffirmation Act. In 1990, it was the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. In 1993, it was the same Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. In 96, it was the Contract with America Advancement Act. 2009, it was a stimulus bill. Again, in 2009, that was a standalone increase. But then in 2010, it was a Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010. And then in 2011, that was the Budget Control Act. Then you go back to 1987, there were 3 increases over a 2-month period, ranging up to 2 months. That included deficit reduction targets as well as automatic sequestration provisions. In 1990, there were 6 temporary increases from 2 days to 2 months. And that also included pay-go, as well as discretionary caps and other programmatic changes. And then in 1996, there were 2 temporary increases, one for a month and 2.5 weeks. And that exempted, again, the 96 Act is very similar to this by exempting from the debt issued for full funding of Social Security and other federal funds, much as we are doing here. So there have been lots of policies that have gone together with increases in the debt limit. There have been rarely standalone debt limit increases over the history of the last 20 years.
Well, we'll debate this some other time, but the circumstances were very different. And the debt ceiling wasn't used as is an effort here for leverage.
Well, I do see that window of opportunity to do those really big things that I know these last two freshman classes have come here to do, and I suspect folks who have come before us are all here to do those same big things. But on the outside chance that we don't succeed, I appreciate the Ways and Means Committee preparing so that the country doesn't pay the cost of any inability to find that agreement. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. Gentlemen, welcome. It's good to see you both. I think here we are again. This is one House bill. The President's not going to pass it. It's a continuation of everything we've done. I think what we've done, one bill, a FAA change, is about it. If my colleagues don't appreciate what the President had to say, let me try a few others. S&P Managing Director of Sovereign Rating, David Beers, quote, "It would mean a very sudden fiscal shock that the longer it lasted would filter powerfully through the system, potentially disruptive to the economy." J.P. Morgan, quote, "It would be like the financial market equivalent of Hieronymus Bush painting of hell," end quote. Keith Hennessy, former President George W. Bush National Economic Council Director, "Payment prioritization does not stop payments, it just delays them. Then the aggrieved party sues the government and probably wins, and it turns into a bloody mess," end quote. Tony Fratto, Deputy Press Secretary for George W. Bush and a spokesman on economic policy who fought through approximately 7 debt limit increases with Congress, quote, "Prioritization is impossible. Is the government really going to be in the position of withholding benefits, salaries, rent, contract payments, and so forth in order to pay off Treasury bondholders? That would be a political catastrophe," end quote. And on my side, we're calling it pay China first. Steve Bell, former Republican staffer with the Senate Budget Committee, now at the Bipartisan Policy Center, quote, "The economic impact of the United States government not honoring literally billions of dollars worth of domestic commitments, bills, and beneficiaries would change the nature of the United States. Call it a default, call it a technical default, it doesn't make any difference. You're not paying the bills you owe on time and in full, and as a practical matter, it can't be done," end quote. Washington Post fact checker, "By available evidence, it appears all but impossible for the Treasury Department to pick and choose among payments or to keep that balancing act up for very long." The Economist magazine, "That would still wreak havoc. Not only would that threaten to send the economy back into recession, it would also deprive doctors, pensioners, contractors, millions of others money needed to meet their own obligations, setting off a chain reaction of defaults. Nor would the sanctity of the debt be guaranteed. Disgruntled creditors could challenge the legality of prioritizing interest payments. Populists could demand that Chinese bondholders be paid last, not first. One miscalculation could leave the Treasury without enough money to make an interest payment. Even a few days' default would roil the global financial system, which relies on treasuries and countless transactions. The mere possibility could incite skittish investors to dump their holdings, driving up interest rates," end quote. I find that pretty compelling that this bill should not be on the floor and should not be going anywhere. And you know, we seem not to have learned a lesson from the last time when we got downgraded for the first time in the history of this republic. And here we go again. But we can't support this on our side.
Would the gentlelady yield for just one moment? I know that folks have begun to call this the Pay China First Act. I just wanted to mention to the gentlelady that if folks didn't have that information, that the number one holders of U.S. Government debt are U.S. individuals and institutions, followed by the U.S. Social Security Trust Fund, followed by the U.S. Federal Reserve, followed by the U.S. Civil Service Retirement Fund, followed by the U.S. Military Retirement Fund, just to make the point that the people we're talking about paying,
well, I think
we're well over 50% of debt. I just,
right,
you may have had that information.
And it's nice of you
I thank the
to give
gentlelady.
that to me. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. Gentleman, Mr. Nugent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, it's hard to follow because we do have some of the brightest minds sitting on this side. And on this side. Okay.
I'm sorry, did that extend all the way to this end?
All the way to the chairman. Absolutely. Well, it kind of ended, no, all the way to the chairman. And also to lovely Ms. Slaughter. I appreciate that. You know, the comments that have been made, and particularly by Mr. Woodall in quoting then Senator Obama, now President Obama, but quoting him in regards to the debt limit, you know, I happen to agree with him that it is truly a indication of failure of leadership, clearly. I think he was right, and I think we're right again in the fact that, and things have changed dramatically, obviously, we're closing in on, what, $17 trillion in debt. And so this legislation, this bill, certainly at least gives a blueprint as to how we would move forward if the unthinkable happens. And based upon the President's own statement, he seemed to be setting this up to exactly for that to happen. When you take a position as to it's my way or the highway, it usually rankles a lot of folks, and I'm sure it does on both sides of the aisle. No matter who's saying it, it's going to upset folks. And so I think that, well, whether you think this is leverage or not, it really is a prudent way to set at least a path forward on the most unthinkable thing that we want to, that would happen. But the President, you know, you can't have it both ways. He wants to have it both ways. I don't think that's possible. And there's not a way to tax your way out of this. Particularly, you know, I think the chairman hit on the head. You know, we talk about 1/3 of the budget, 1/3 of the spending that we actually have control over during this time, and you have 2/3 over here that are really driving this. And so I agree with the chairman that we've got to have serious discussions in regards to how this moves forward. So I don't have a question. I just want to make that statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Gentleman. Just back time. Mr. Webster.
I only wanted to say one thing. There was a couple of times that our credit rating has been brought up that it went down. I want everyone to understand and remember our credit rating went down because we were paying our bills, not because we didn't pay our bills. The bills were too much, and therefore they reduced it because we were unwilling to lower the amount of bills we were paying. They reduced our credit rating. It wasn't a fact that we had defaulted on anything. It was the fact we were paying our bills is why our credit rating went down.
Gentleman appears to have yielded back his time. Chairwoman, Ms. Rosley.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman for both of them for being with us. This bill simply takes the possibility of default off the table and pays for liabilities that we in Congress have approved and we've committed to funding. I absolutely support spending cuts, but simply deciding not to pay the money we already owe, as we know, is a luxury we can't afford. It's not an option. The full faith and credit of the United States of America should not be compromised because Congress and the President can't make budget cuts in the proper way. That's what I hear from constituents down home all the time. And default will likely cause a dramatic increase in interest rates, and our constituents will let us know because their cost of mortgages will go up, their car loans, their credit card rates will go up. So we're just now emerging from the worst recession in decades, and this growth could easily be undone at the risk of another recession. And as Mr. Camp has pointed out, and so many of our other members have pointed out, much of the U.S. debt is held by Americans, American investors, businesses, mutual funds, pension funds, retirees. They should not be punished for investing in America. Social Security was designed to help seniors rest easy, knowing that their needs would be partially be met and provided for. This assurance has to remain. And our men and women in the armed forces fight every day for the freedoms that we sometimes take so lightly. We can't turn our backs on them. So spending cuts, tax reform, those are solutions that we look forward to working with all of you on to get our budget in line, but not the refusal to pay our bills. That will not be a step forward. So I thank the gentleman for for his work product. And I yield back, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Chairwoman. Dr.
Thank you.
Burgess?
Mr. Chairman, I just have a question for Mr. Camp. I mean, as you've studied this, passage of this bill this week, is that likely to have a negative effect on the markets? Will they look at this and say, oh, well, Congress is anticipating a default, or Congress is behaving responsibly in preparing for this crisis?
The bill, I believe, because it takes default off the table and sets up a mechanism in which the United States will pay its debt and interest on the debt, that I think that obviously we don't want to get to the point where, at the end of the day, we have a problem on all the other obligations of the United States, but this will set a clear path that at least those obligations that would result in a direct downgrade of our credit rating will be paid. I think strengthens the position going forward that we are interested in not defaulting, that we're interested in trying to make sure that our obligations are paid.
If you don't mind, I think if you ask economists, the vast majority will completely disagree. The message here is we'll pay bondholders, we'll pay Social Security, but everything else is up for grabs.
Yeah, just reclaiming my time.
That's the reality of this bill.
Reclaiming my time, obviously I've watched these debt and fiscal discussions for some time, and I've heard the arguments that we simply cannot end this program because people will be hurt, people will be denied Head Start, people will be denied health care. Look, there is a day of reckoning coming, and I think any of us with any maturity recognize that. I can't tell you when it's going to be, but I know what's going to happen. The Fed will take $110 billion down to the Bureau of Public Debt, put it up for sale, and no one buys. And on that day, the interest rate begins to go up. And how high it goes up and how fast it goes up, no one can tell us. And how the Fed deals with that, no one can tell us. But I know this. On that day, you and I are going to be inconvenienced, Mr. Levin. The people at the lower ends of the income spectrum in this country, they're going to be devastated. So it is not just incumbent upon us. History demands that we do something about this. This is not a panacea that we're going to consider this week, but it is a step along that process, and I'm happy to support it. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate Dr. Burgess and your comments. I'd like to thank both of you for being here. I think the record at one point will reflect the meaning and purpose behind this, and that is the willingness and the engagement by Republicans and Democrats of the United States House of Representatives from one of our most distinguished committees, the Ways and Means Committee, have brought forth not just testimony today, but ideas. It's my hope that what would be reflective of this is, whether it becomes law or not, we've been told it will never become law, but that we have spoken, we have provided our ideas, and we have spent a good number of sessions up in the Rules Committee where we have talked about trying to make sure that the President, from a Republican and a Democrat perspective, the ideas that were shared here, that the President would recognize, I think, the reality of the circumstance, and that is that if we continue down this pathway, it is far, far worse, and we will get to the point where we negotiate, as the Europeans have done, on pennies on a dollar that they will pay back, and their future, our future, then would be diminished. The best way to look at this, I can't tell you, but one way I can tell you, we negotiated. I was up here on the Rules Committee years ago. We used to negotiate with the President of the United States, Mr. Clinton, and Mr. Clinton negotiated at some point for his, what turned out to be an attribute of his, and that is we had a stunningly successful economy. He decided to work with Republicans. He decided to accept our ideas, and we didn't care who took credit. You know we didn't care, Mr. Kemp. And he took Republican ideas, and this country leaped forward significantly. Jobs, job creation, investment, moving our country forward where careers became important to people again. And I would tell you that I think that your policy that you're helping us formulate here is about publicly asking the President of the United States to begin working with Republicans. The President's already said he doesn't intend to work with us. What a negative chance for us if we accepted that and said, well, it doesn't matter what we do. But you didn't do that. You accepted this as an opportunity. I admire you for it. I admire both of you for coming here today. I think we bettered our circumstance. The United States House of Representatives will have a chance to put our best foot forward on these leading-edge ideas tomorrow, and I want to thank you for your testimony and your time. You're both excused. Furthering testimony now, the Rules Committee being available and open, we want to welcome one of our former members, a robust young man who has vigor and enthusiasm, the gentleman from Vermont. And perhaps, Mr. Delaney, I don't know, is this your first time before the Rules Committee? Well, welcome. We welcome the gentleman from Vermont and from Maryland. As is always the custom, please know that without objection we'll accept anything in writing that you brought with you. Otherwise, we would encourage, as Mr. Welsh knows, a summary of the testimony that you would expect to give here of your amendment, and the gentleman from Vermont's recognized.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's delightful to be back here. My amendment would essentially allow the members of Congress to have a vote on a clean extension of the debt ceiling. And I just want to make a couple of points. Number one, we are engaged in this House of Representatives in a very serious debate about what to do about a very serious problem, namely the massive debt that we have to deal with. And we have different points of view about how best to accomplish that. One tool that is now being proposed to use as a negotiating tactic is the debt ceiling. And I acknowledge that the President, when he was a senator, in my words, grandstanded on the debt. And it's been a tradition in this House of Representatives, mostly for the out-of-power, the party that's out of power, to use the debt ceiling as an opportunity, basically to challenge the economic policies of the sitting President. When, in August of 2011, we went beyond that, in my view, and actually went to the brink of default, so much so that the S&P gave the United States its first downgrade in the history of the country, resulting, according to the Treasury, in an increase in debt expenses of $1.3 trillion and significant shock in the stock market. That crossed a line where we went from grandstanding to actually making the markets fear that America would not pay its bills. My view, this is my view, when we crossed that line, it had only negative consequences for our ability to solve the problem that all sides acknowledge has to be addressed, namely a very substantial debt. So my view on this is that there's two things. One, on the substance, my view is that we should acknowledge our debts and pay our debts and not make distinctions on which bills will be paid and which won't be paid. And Mr. Cole, you indicated that you've got to prepare for the worst. One of the things I've noticed we're doing around here, all sides, is creating the worst. And I think we can avoid that by essentially declaring a truce. The bills incurred are bills that have to be paid. And that means that there's a lot of expenditures that are in that debt that I was against. You know, the war in Iraq, the nation building in Afghanistan. I did oppose the Bush tax cuts. People disagreed with me. But my view is that I have an obligation as a member of Congress to honor those obligations that our elected representatives obligated America to take. So that's one. The second is I do believe that regular order on these major questions before the country, all sides should have a debate, have a vote. And I clearly disagree, I think, with the majority in this committee as to the merits of this bill. But why isn't it a good thing to allow us to debate this on the floor and permit those of us who do disagree to have a vigorous debate with the proponents of this legislation and get a yes or no vote on a clean debt ceiling? So that's the purpose of my amendment, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Welsh. It's pretty clear that you miss us a lot. the
I do.
engagement? I didn't hear you really say it, but it's obvious to me by your actions.
It is.
Excitement of you being here today.
You are a perceptive chairman.
Among other things.
I miss you.
I miss you too, Peter, and I'm delighted that you're here today. Gentleman, Mr. Lane is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I enjoyed your closing comments to the prior panel. I thought you struck the right chord in terms of expressing our need to work together. And so I come with my amendment from the perspectives or thinking about H.R. 807 in the context that my colleagues are in fact trying to do the right thing with respect to dealing with avoiding a second debt ceiling crisis. I do think they have the right intentions. I think there's an acknowledgement that the last time we had a debt ceiling crisis, it was a self-inflicted wound in terms of what it did to uncertainty in the capital markets and in terms of what it did to job creation in this country. But I worry that the bill, as crafted, has the risk of other potentially even more serious unintended consequences. And that's not even about the notion of being in default of some obligations and not others and the consequence of that, which are significant. In the private sector, most indebtedness has provisions that are called cross defaults. And the reason they have those things is an acknowledgement if you're in default of certain obligations, you're probably not a good credit as it relates to other obligations that you're not in default of. But what really concerns me is the notion that we are somehow permanently tainting the view of the United States credit in the eyes of everyone who could be our counterparty. And what I mean by that, again, to think of it in a private sector context, the best credits in the world, the best corporations in the world, the ones that are considered the best borrowers that you could possibly lend money to, borrow on a non-prioritized basis. In other words, the market does not demand that they have to rank order their debts, because the market has a view that the likelihood of these companies defaulting is very, very low. And these companies spend a significant amount of time making sure they never have to borrow on a prioritized basis. Weaker companies, to contrast it to their situation, they're forced to borrow on a prioritized basis. They have to say, this is my first debt, this is my second debt, this is my third debt, and the market reacts accordingly and prices the debt accordingly. The best companies spend a lot of their time making sure they never borrow on a prioritized basis, and the weaker companies spend all their time trying to borrow on a non-prioritized basis. And it seems to me to be in conflict with our fiduciary duties to this country to voluntarily borrow on a prioritized basis. Because what will come next? Will the next time we have to issue treasuries, will the market demand that those treasuries go ahead of other treasuries? And I just think that we never want to think about our country and its obligations in that context. And that there's a better way to avoid a debt ceiling debate, which is what my amendment intends to do. Under my amendment, if both houses of Congress, if the House and the Senate were to jointly pass a budget, which I understand is a rare sighting around here, but if they were to do that, and that budget, according to the CBO, would project that the debt as a percentage of the economy were 70% or below in years 9 or 10, then the debt ceiling could automatically be raised by operation of the fact that that budget is in place and approved. And that allows us to go about the business of managing the affairs of the country, not having debt ceiling debates, which are destructive and politically difficult, provided we've put the country on a sustainable trajectory towards managing our fiscal condition across the long term. So tying the debt ceiling and its ability to go up to the fact that we have budgets approved by the House and the Senate that reduce the debt to 70% or below in years 9 or 10 is what my amendment proposes to do. I think it's a less destructive way, quite frankly, to deal with the debt ceiling debate, and I think it would allow us to focus on the real work we have to do, which is putting the country on a sustainable fiscal trajectory, which does involve entitlement reform, which does involve comprehensive tax reform, and does involve us looking at our discretionary spending and aligning them better with our priorities as a country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to thank both of you for being here today. Your ideas are very clear. I will tell you that during my years, I have hated to raise the debt ceiling. I've voted that way very often. I believe something should be extracted, and it's called an agreement between the President and Congress about the spending of money and what the priorities are. And I will tell you that President Bush well understood this as he engaged despite a growing economy. We have to be serious about what we're doing. Getting us together is hard. is difficult. But for someone to not offer their best ideas would be less than their best performance. And I believe what we're trying to do is engage early on the President of the United States, the Secretary of Treasury of the United States, perhaps the United States Senate, but at least this body on our ideas, and that's what this Rules Committee is all about. You've had a chance to come up here and express your ideas, and this makes us stronger and better. And I encourage you, Mr. Delaney, as a brand new member of this body, to keep coming up here, have your ideas, you'll be heard from, and that we will have a chance to debate these on the floor. And I want to thank both of you for being here. Mrs. Fox.
Thank you very much. I'm always pleased to see Congressman Welch, and glad to have you, Mr. Delaney, here for the first time. I have no questions. Thank you for being here.
Ms. Slaughter? Mr. Bishop.
Congressman Welch, I just can't resist this one. In those years when I was in the wilderness and I was assigned to come up here and make presentations, you were always very friendly, positive. Every time I have seen you come up here since that time, you've always been friendly and positive, and now you have said that you actually enjoyed this experience and miss it. So are you a sadist or a masochist? Or both?
Well, see, when I was here, we had better art on the walls. You know,
Yeah, I noticed the cows are gone. I wonder what
Let's get some Texas.
Gentlemen, would yield to me just for a second. We used to have fine artwork up here, no bull, but it was a cow, a Texas cow, and my wife is going to provide some better landscapes soon.
We don't want Dreyer to be, coming in here.
It was nice
art on the wall.
It was nice.
Yeah, I bet. I bet it was. Oh, thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Hey, I'm a Westerner. I enjoyed cattle up there. That's great. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yield
Thank you,
back.
Mr. Bishop. Thanks a lot.
Good. Mr. McGovern.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank you both for being here. And, I'll go back to what I said in the very beginning. I regret that we're spending time doing this underlying bill when I think we should be moving to a conference on the budget or trying to figure out sequestration and actually do things that we know are going to get this economy on the right track. The underlying bill to me proves that everything has to be political, which some things shouldn't be. Making sure that we don't default on our obligations is one of them. And again, when Mr. Burgess said that if everything goes bad, we'll be inconvenienced, but the poor will be devastated. They're already being devastated by your sequestration that was supported. Food banks are being closed, people losing Head Start, people losing WIC. It's happening now. And those aren't the people that ride on airplanes all the time. So, the people riding on airplanes aren't inconvenienced, but the poor in this country are right now. So I point that out. But I'll just say, finally, I think your two amendments are actually good, thoughtful amendments, and I hope they're made in order. That's everybody's so happy to see you. I would like to think that that would translate into making sure that your amendment's in order. So we look forward to having that, seeing you on the floor tomorrow debating these things. So I hope there's an open rule. We don't have open rules around here anymore, but it'd be nice to do so on something like this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chairman Cole.
Well, I'm always happy to see my friend from Vermont, but I must reflect, if you were here, I certainly wouldn't be. So, I'm not sure that I welcome you back to committee. I welcome you to appear before the committee, but I think a number of us would not be here were you restored. So we love you, but there's a limit. John and I, gentleman from Maryland, I had an opportunity to have a good discussion about this, and I think he makes a lot of very compelling points about the nature of the debt and the danger where we're headed here. And I appreciate the gentleman from Vermont also pointing out that the President's essentially asking a Republican Congress to do for him what he refused to do for George Bush, and pontificated about, orated about, and rubbed it in. And that's a little bit beyond the normal gamesmanship. He really used it, and again, now he's asking us to do something. And by the way, I voted for the last debt ceiling increase while he was President of the United States, something he never did when he was in the Senate. And I voted both, like my friend from Texas, voted both for and against debt ceiling increases over time, depending, I would think, usually whether I thought we were in an imminent crisis, a war, or whether I thought there was really a serious intent to try and manage the debt. And I think that is probably the thing that causes the most angst on our side of the aisle. I'll give you certainly both an opportunity to, because we don't see that from the president. And given that, whether we're right or wrong, there's just simply not going to be the votes there absent some sort of compelling deal. The idea, politics isn't exactly like the corporate world. Corporate world actually has responsible governance in it. The president actually proposed at one point that he basically be given unilaterally the power to decide what the debt level. No corporation would do that for any CEO. So that wasn't a serious suggestion. I would also say that saying you're not going to negotiate on something that you're going to have to negotiate on to get done is surely not a serious suggestion. It's either being extraordinarily naive or threatening, saying I'm going to use the debt as a weapon. If you don't automatically give me what I want without condition, the country will be plunged into some sort of crisis. Well, we tried that where each side dared the other over sequester. And I would say each side misjudged the other really badly. Our side thought no commander-in-chief would allow something like sequester to occur, let alone when we were in combat situation. And I think the president said, well, no majority would ever risk this to defense. And guess what? They were both wrong. So rightly or wrongly, I do think we're engaged in a political process here of positioning and negotiation. I wish it weren't so, but I think it's the case, and I think it's naive not to recognize it's the case. Now, I still hope for a deal that I can vote for. I really do. I mean, I did not enjoy voting for the last debt ceiling. I won't enjoy voting for the next one. It will create an enormous political problem for me and many of my colleagues, and I'm sure for your colleagues on your side of the aisle. But I'll do it if there's some assurance that we were on some path to restore some level of fiscal balance. It doesn't have to be exactly what I would think it should be. It doesn't have to be the Ryan budget. But it does have to be some negotiated settlement between the two parties. And again, I give the president some considerable credit for putting a couple things on the table that no Democratic president has ever put on the table before, and he's gotten some flack for doing that. And again, I made the point in the previous presentation, I don't think he's gotten the credit from our side that he should get for having done that. We've put some pretty serious things on the table, too. So, I still see the outlines of a deal, but we're not going to get there again, it's a political fantasy to believe the debt is just going to be raised unconditionally by a Republican Congress. So, given that, I actually agree with my friend, Mr. McGovern. I wish we were in some sort of more negotiation. I think at some point we will be, but I do think these are all preliminaries leading up. And I do think there's some merit in saying, we're thinking of what happens if the unthinkable happens. We didn't do that really realistically with sequester. And I'm not saying this is the best solution, but it's a solution, and it's probably a message to the other side, hey, let's not go here, but if we do, don't take us lightly. So, I'm going to give you both a chance to respond. There's not a particular question, because I think, again, you offer serious amendments. I appreciate it. You're both very, very serious members of Congress, and I suspect if we arrive at a deal that I can vote for, it'll probably be a deal that both of you can vote for as well. But we're going to have a bipartisan vote on a very consequential issue, and there's just simply not the votes here, absent some larger deal, to do it. Nobody's going to trust the president with that kind of unlimited authority to raise debt. I wouldn't trust a Republican president with this, not aimed just at President Obama. I wouldn't trust any president with that kind of ability. So the debt ceiling to me is performing a very useful function. It's making us look at these things, think about them, argue about them, and sooner or later, hopefully, sometime late this summer, this fall, we'll arrive at some agreement that reassures the financial markets, but also moves us in the direction of some sort of stability. And again, I'm open on the elements of what that agreement would be, but I would like, as my friend Mr. McGovern suggested, perhaps we could start talking about it sometime in the not too distant future. So If you want to respond, great, otherwise I'd yield back.
Well, just quickly, I want us to get a deal too. I mean, a grand bargain, a lot of us think is the right way to go. And we're not going to get that here. My amendment really is a request by me to this committee to let the members vote on whether they want to support the legislation as proposed or they want to support a clean debt ceiling. And that's, I think, a very serious discussion because there's implications either way. I'm not here to try to dissuade you of the urgency that motivates your legislation. I am here to say that I believe there's significant consequences to having the debt and obligations of the country injected into our very difficult negotiations. So it's a dilemma, as you know, Mr. Cole, because in fact we do have to have a negotiation. We're not going to get anything done around here unless we find a way to get it done together. And I suspect the motivation here is you think that'll get the President's attention, get him to the table, and maybe make a deal. But it may also do as the last one did, further impair our credit rating. I think Mr. Delaney's got immense experience in the credit markets and speaks very wisely about this. So that's my worry. And as a member of Congress, I'm prepared to say to my constituents, I think that debt incurred is an obligation that we have to pay. And I'll take some grief for that, but it's clean, it's clear, and I'd welcome the opportunity to vote on that. So,
just a quick question, a serious question too. Are you prepared to vote for just a straight debt ceiling increase with no prospect for any change in the trajectory? And I'm not asking, more revenue. Would you vote for it even if there's no change of behavior by either or both sides and no larger deal in profit?
I would, and I'll tell you, not with any enthusiasm. But here's the dilemma that I think we're in. The real moment when we have to be responsible about spending is when we approve the authorization to spend. So, for instance, the Iraq War is going to cost money. And if we we approve that expenditure for legitimate reasons, or we oppose it, there are costs that are associated with that. And when the bill comes due, say a year or two later, we have an argument about the debt ceiling. I don't agree with that.
If I may, and not to interrupt, but and to add to your point, actually, it's not the times that we vote on expenditures that I worry about around here. It's all the expenditures that we don't vote on that are on automatic pilot, on the entitlement side of the budget. And we don't vote on those, and we never vote on those. Well, that's why I was actually proud of the President for putting something on the table, because that's where the problem is. The problem isn't what we spend, it's what we've obligated, and not necessarily us, but other Congresses over the years, and that we never go back and revisit and reconcile with financial reality.
Yeah. Well, you've got a good point, but we've authorized that, and at the moment of authorization is the moment when we have to figure out a way to pay for it. I mean, I'm a pay-as-you-go kind of person, but I think those decisions about the authorization to expend, even on entitlements, and the obligation to pay ought to be married. I've just got a note from my Chief of Staff, and I'm going to ask permission to be excused. And no?
The gentleman came up here to testify. He's going to take all the questions.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
Can I respond to Tom's?
Yes.
Yeah. So, look, I think what I propose in my amendment is not an unconditional raising of the debt ceiling, but tying the debt ceiling to something that I deem worthy and appropriate, which is having a joint budget that actually gets the debt to a controllable level. And I think that would be an appropriate forcing function. I come to this debate with a view that the debt, if not reined in over time, does threaten the Republic. We have to deal with this. Forcing functions are useful to force people to deal with things, and the debt ceiling clearly can serve as a forcing function, but I think it should do it to a point. And I do agree with your notion around how we should think about coming to a compromise here, because I think we have to remind ourselves that economic matters are always on the margin. They're never binary like other issues. So when we talk about unemployment in this country, for example, we have 8% unemployment. We all think the number's higher than that, but let's stay with the 8% unemployment. That means we have 92% of people who are working. So when we make a decision to deal with unemployment, we have to realize that all those decisions that are targeted to help people who are unemployed, which we should be doing, have the potential to hurt people who are employed. And that's just an example of how economic and fiscal policy work. It's always on the margin. And I think we have to think about this fiscal situation in the same context, which is why compromise is such the obvious solution, because it's all on the margin. And there's no right answer. The one thing I know for sure is that if a very liberal economist writes a column about what we should do and a very conservative columnist writes a column about what we should do, if you go to 99% of the people in the real business community, they would say, well, they both have to make some good points, they both make some bad points. It's never that clear. And so I think, and I think the President, I agree with the President's move that he made in his budget. He is the leader. He has to take some leadership on this, and I think he did with his budget. But back to the debt ceiling, I think it would be very difficult not to vote to raise the debt ceiling and continue to do that, because the consequences, it's both the most irrelevant thing and the most consequential thing at the same time, and you rarely find that in life, because it's irrelevant because it actually has nothing to do with the fiscal trajectory of the country, truly. Mm-hmm. We could have a 5 or 10 or 15-year very positive or very negative future that could be unrelated to the debt limit at that moment in time. So to some extent, it's completely irrelevant to the future. But it's incredibly consequential, because the ramifications to the country if we actually are in default and what that means, because it's uncharted territory. So it's a weird forcing function, because its consequences are unknown and its relevance is actually fairly limited. So that would be my view.
Our distinguished guest, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our distinguished guest has indicated to us his desire to quickly go through any questions that you have. So I'd like to direct the committee, if I could, to please go to Mr. Welsh first, and let's go that line of questions.
Thank you, Mr.
Woodall. I don't have any questions for Mr. Welch. I would like to ask Mr. Delaney.
We'll ask Mr. Delaney to please stick around.
I have no questions.
Mr. Webster. Dr. Burgess.
I feel your pain. We'll see you in Energy and Commerce.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Welsh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And tell your chief, I'm just a toughie today, but we value your testimony today, and thank you very much. Continuing on now with Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, thank you for agreeing to stick around here. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Delaney, I serve on the Budget Committee as well as the Rules Committee. I can't support your amendment because it eliminates the entire prioritization effort that we're at work on with this bill today. But I think it's a fascinating idea you have about how to get the executive invested in helping the Congress come to an agreement on a concurrent budget resolution, which we have not done, I believe, since the late 1990s. My fear is that if you make 70% the debt ceiling, it quickly becomes the floor. There is no forcing function beyond 70%. As long as we're at 68%, I can operate with impunity as the executive. Would you envision that being dialed down over time, or does 70% represent some sort of not just manageable but desirable debt level?
I think it represents a desirable debt level in a 10-year time horizon based on the facts as they present themselves today. So if we were starting at zero debt, I would answer that question very differently, right? I wouldn't say, yeah, we should just borrow up to 7% if we're at zero today, unless there was an imminent need for lots of borrowing to do something in our country. I wouldn't say that 70% is like a standard that we should seek as a permanent framework for how we think about our debt across 10 years. But I think it's a relevant goal and a realistic goal, an achievable goal, and a worthy goal for us based on where we are now. We're obviously above that now, right? And left unchecked, we'll continue to go above that. So without any action, i.e. the cost of doing nothing is not nothing, without any action, it'll continue to go up. So I think in the context of the headwinds around the entitlement programs, other commitments that we have, where we find ourselves today, because you can't ignore the facts, we are where we are today, that I think it's a realistic goal. I mean, in my judgment, what we should be doing is we should, obviously, the first thing I'll tell you in terms of specifics, and I wrote an editorial in the Washington Post today about what I talked about in the, about why I think this bill is not a particularly good idea. Again, I'm not questioning people's intent. I just think there's potentially unintended consequences here. And I went through what I think we should do. We should have entitlement reform by adopting changed CPI, raising the retirement age for people who are not engaged in manual labor, and raising the cap for Social Security. We should have tax reform by adopting something like the Buffett rules so that wealthy Americans do pay the same as middle-class Americans. We should close certain corporate tax loopholes, and we should lower corporate tax rates to make our country more competitive. And then we should go through discretionary spending and defense spending and have a real discussion about our priorities as a country, which to me is about our children, about protecting our nation, and about taking care of those that are in fact left behind and making sure their programs. And we should reallocate discretionary and defense spending, not that dissimilar to the general levels as proposed by the sequester, but in a more intelligent way. I think if you do those three things, you can get the debt to 70% of GDP in 10 years, and the debt could actually go up while you're getting there because you know you've put in place the mechanisms to get it down.
I'm relatively new here, 3 years, 2 years and 4 months in Congress, but I was a staffer around here for a long time, and I tell constituents back home, if I promise you I'm going to do something in years 9 and year 10, you might as well just forget about it because it's going to get changed by year 2, and then again in year 4, then again in year 6. I don't know how one would prevent the gamesmanship that would surely happen with we're going to keep spending at our normal profligate levels until year 8, and then we're just going to go off this giant sequester cliff that's going to fix it. But I think it's a fascinating idea about how to get the executive involved and how to get, I'm a big believer in skin in the game. If you just listed in that editorial, getting more Americans back on the tax rolls, even if it's just for $1, so we're all participants in the funding of our income tax system. I'd have been on board with everything you had there. I would love to be able to find a way to work with you to get that in that topic of budget reforms that the Budget Committee is going to talk about. Again, I don't know what that level is, don't know what that time frame is, but I've never heard that idea suggested. I think it's a neat one, which is why having folks testify.
Well, you can vote for it, so.
It's part 2. If I could offer a secondary amendment to strip out the non-partization part. But, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Webster. Dr. Burgess. I want to thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
You'll
Chairman.
probably have a chance to go home tonight, know about the neighborhood you live in.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope you go home and tell your wife and your kids, wow, you survived this thing. The Rules Committee is an important committee. Well, we weren't today, that's for sure. It's because you shared ideas with us, and I don't think we're here to beat up all the ideas. We're here to listen to you. We're here to try and take what you've said, and I hope other people heard it too. We've tried to speak with clarity. We've tried to engage the President of the United States and our friends on the other side of this Capitol. Most of all, what we're trying to do is to make sure that we're up debating the issues and ideas before they become problems and before we have to decide exactly how we're going to tackle what lies ahead of us. So I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Gentleman's now excused. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that some paper information that Chairman Camp has made available to me would be available without objection. That will happen. We have now come to the end of the hearing, and the hearing on H.R. 807 is now closed, seeing no further witnesses that would be available. And the chair would like to acknowledge that we are not prepared to move forward with any motion at this time. And so we will be in recess, and I would anticipate that it will be a longer period of time, more than 15 or 20 minutes. So I would encourage us to know that we will provide the information as quickly as possible, give notice as we normally do, and we'll come back in. So we'll now be in recess, pending the call of the chair.
Tom?
Committee will be in order. Thank you very much for the time that we were allowed to hopefully get our paperwork in order on H.R. 807, Full Faith and Credit Act. Chairman, now be in receipt of a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant H.R. 807, the Full Faith and Credit Act, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means and now printed in the bill shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only the amendment printed in the Rules Committee report, if offered by Representative Camp of Michigan or his designee, which shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion by the gentlewoman from Grandfather Community, North Carolina, and I would like to provide a little bit of content behind this motion. There were 16 amendments that were provided to the Rules Committee, 11 that were non-germane, 2 that were withdrawn, and 1 that was made in order. And you now have had an opportunity to sit through the hearing today and to see that we had good debate, good discussion, and the floor is now open for any amendment or debate.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grayson's amendment was germane, I think, was it not? Mr. Amendments?
Let's see. If you go 16 minus 11, that's 5. 5 minus 2 is 3, and we made 1 in order.
At least Grayson out.
I believe that would be
even
correct.
though it was in order.
I believe that would be correct.
All right, well, the one we've got, we have some curiosity about it because it says, it talks about members' pay. And since the prioritization only dealt with bondholders and Social Security, neither of those are responsible for members' pay. So could you just give us what the germaneness actually of this amendment?
Well, I guess, as best I could say is provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Well, I'm talking about the amendment.
I'm well aware of that. It was a decision not to get into member pay. And
it's germane to this bill, which deals with Social Security and bondholders, and does not deal at all with members' pay.
It would deal with members' pay.
Why? With those, well, neither Social Security or the bondholders, where our payroll comes from.
I don't think I'm arguing whether it dealt with member pay or not.
Well, that's what the amendment amends. Clarifies prohibition on compensation for members of Congress, classifies language to require that the Secretary report to that, which is entirely different. But we're just the members' compensation, since it doesn't come from bondholders, nor does it come from Social Security.
Right.
We didn't see the germaneness of it to this particular bill.
What I believe the debate is on is about the addressing of that, of the member pay, but putting it, as it says here, clarifying the prohibition on compensation and clarifies language that requires the Secretary to report to Congress anytime new authority is used. In other words, if it is going to be something that is a prohibition, then we would discuss it. This exactly, I believe, what he was asking for also.
But I have to tell you, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because nothing in this bill talks about members' compensation.
What it does talk about is what we believe should and should not be included within a prioritization of what we would pay or not pay. And I believe that the way I'd understood it is that he did try and address that.
Who did? Mr. Camp?
No. The amendment that
There was an amendment, but it wasn't made in order.
And
on pay. That was
that
Jim
was.
Cooper.
Oh, was that Jim Cooper?
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry. I thought that was.
No, it's Jim Cooper's amendment dealt with members' pay, but we didn't even discuss that. I don't see any, I must say, I don't see the germaneness of members' pay in a bill that says that
Well, it's
what we
federal
will do
government.
if the government cannot reach the debt limit agreement, that we will continue to pay bondholders and Social Security, and then we come up with an amendment. Members' pay, none of it which comes from either of those two exceptions.
It is still part of a document that we are trying to say about how our own pay would be handled in the event of a shutdown.
Well, you know, I said earlier today, I don't think this is going to become law, and if it goes to the Senate, it's going to be vetoed. But once again, it shows you what sequestration is. We do all of a sudden everyone says, "Oh, gee, I didn't know it did that." And so we deal with airlines and leave people in cancer treatment out.
That's why we're trying to put it in here so people would now.
Of course.
Yeah, no, I'm looking at the two amendments here, and Mr. Cooper's amendment is pretty emphatic. Stops congressional pay if U.S. defaults on national debt. The Camp language seems kind of confusing and fuzzy and doesn't seem like it does anything. So I guess it may be, it is meaningless, and if it is, that's fine, and, you know.
It won't be the first time.
Right, but I think we were just trying to figure out
We wonder
what the effect of it was, because.
You know what, I will ask right now and find out what the line is between Mr. Cooper's not being germane and mine being germane.
All right.
The Camp amendment.
I don't believe this camp is germane, but nonetheless. All right, and I would like to make my usual amendment, if I may. Immigration.
Okay, thank you very much. The Cooper amendment places member pay onto one of the permissible items that would be allowed for debt to be extended to.
But it wasn't allowed. Was it
The
found on
Camp amendment clarifies that there are, under any new debt, that a member pay would not be included.
But does it not seem
in
apparent
that.
to you that if Jim Cooper was non-germane, that this one is as well?
Except that the line that they drew there, as I understood it, was he was adding to the debt without.
I don't think it means anything anyway.
Only the.
No, it doesn't.
Structure it. Okay. I see
Chairman, we
that.
can
I
just
see
go
that.
on. Let's
Well, let's get this out, because it is this is not just art. This is actually in the bill. It does not. It says what's in. It does not try and prioritize it. It just said these items.
It's to prioritize, is it not?
No.
That if
It would provide what would be in there, but it does not say what's first, second, third, fourth, fifth, like what we might have in a bankruptcy option. And because this prioritized it, it put where it was as opposed to on the list. That was the difference.
Well, we'll just move on.
Does the gentlewoman wish?
I do want to make an amendment.
Awesome.
This bill is called Full Faith and Credit Act, but we think we'd like to call it Pay China First, because it prioritizes foreign bondholders and hurts American families and veterans and active duty soldiers. With debt ceiling set to hit on May 19th, we need to start using smart policies to help the country stay economically secure And so we should have an open rule so that all members can be heard, and therefore I move that we make this rule open so that all members can be heard.
The gentlewoman has offered an amendment for an open rule, and as for the stated reasons, including the 16 amendments and the 11 that were non-germane, I would support a no vote. Those in favor of the Slaughter Amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
I have no further amendments, Mr. McGovern.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers to the amendment by Representative Grayson, number 4, which would add the Federal Hospital Insurance Trust Fund to the list of eligible obligations of which the Treasury must continue to fund when the statutory debt limit is reached.
You've now heard the McGovern Amendment. Any discussion? Those in favor of the McGovern Amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote.
Ms. Fox? No. Ms. Fox? No. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent? No. Mr. Webster? Ms. Ross-Leitonen? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report.
2 yeas, 5 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Further amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman's right.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment by Mr. Grayson, number 3, which would add obligations held by the Military Retirement Fund.
Gentleman's amendment has now been heard. Any discussion? Those in favor of the McGovern Amendment signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
As for roll call, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman, as for roll call.
Ms. Fox? No. Ms. Fox? No. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Nugent? No. Mr. Nugent? No. Mr. Webster? Ms. Ross-Leitonen? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report.
2 yeas, 5 nays.
Amendment's not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion?
One other amendment, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers to the amendment by Representative Grayson, number 5, which would ensure that the payment of debt obligations held by the American public are prioritized.
You've heard the amendment by the gentleman. Any discussion? Those in favor of the McGovern Amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
As for roll call, Mr.
Roll
Chairman.
call.
Ms. Fox? No. Ms. Fox? No. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Nugent? No. Mr. Nugent? No. Mr. Webster? Ms. Ross-Leitonen? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report.
2 yeas, 5 nays.
The McGovern Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion?
No.
Seeing none, we now move to the motion on the floor from the gentlewoman from North Carolina. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have roll call.
Chair.
Ms. Fox? Aye. Ms. Fox? Aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Nugent? Aye. Mr. Nugent? Aye. Mr. Webster? Ms. Ross-Leitonen? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter? No. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Chairman? Aye.
Clerk report.
5 yeas, 2 nays.
The motion is agreed to. I will be handling this for the Republicans. And the gentlewoman will be handling for the minority. I do not anticipate that we have any further Rules Committee meetings set for the week. I want to thank everybody for their time and attention. And the committee's is done.